The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday in March of 1882, and it had the wrong name written on the outside. Nora Hale had been sitting at the small pine table in the back room of her aunt's boarding house in Millhaven, Ohio, when she finally put quill to paper and did what she had been dreading and hoping in equal measure for the better part of 6 weeks. The advertisement had come through the Millhaven Gazette, tucked between a notice about a church raffle and an announcement regarding new tariff regulations on imported wool. It was small and plainly worded, the way honest men tend to write. It said that a rancher in the New Mexico territory, a man named Marcus Winslow, was seeking a wife of steady character and willing disposition, someone who could endure the hardship of frontier living and who was not afraid of wide open sky. He said he was 31 years of age, that he owned 400 acres near a town called Copperfield, that he kept cattle and 2 horses, and that he could offer a proper home and a decent life. He had written the advertisement himself, which Nora could tell from the slightly uneven grammar and the way certain words had been crossed out and replaced with better ones, suggesting a man who cared about how he came across, but did not have someone to polish his words for him. Nora was 24 years old. She had dark auburn hair she wore pinned up but which escaped in soft curls at her temples, and she had eyes the color of dark river water, serious and watchful, the kind of eyes that made people feel she was listening even when she said nothing at all. She was not unbeautiful, but she had never given much thought to it one way or another, having been raised in a household that valued labor over vanity. Her mother had died of a fever when Nora was 15. Her father had remarried within the year, a practical woman named Cordelia who had her own 3 children from a prior marriage and who was kind enough but who made the boarding house feel smaller than it was. Nora had been promised once, to a young man named Thomas Garrett who worked at the mill. They had been engaged for 2 years, and then one cold November morning he had appeared at the boarding house door with his hat in his hands, and told her in a low and miserable voice that he had fallen in love with a girl from Sandusky, and that he was sorry. And Nora had looked at him for a long moment, and then said that she hoped they would both be happy, and she had closed the door quietly and gone upstairs and cried until her chest hurt, and then she had stopped. Because there was supper to make and her aunt was not well. That had been 8 months ago, and in those 8 months Nora had thought a great deal about what she wanted her life to look like. The boarding house was not it. Ohio was good country, solid and green, but she had always been drawn to the idea of something more open, something where the horizon was not cut off by elm trees and church steeples. She had read articles about the Western territories. She had read about cattle ranches and the desert sky, and the particular quality of silence that existed out in the open land where civilization had not yet caught everything and pressed it flat. So she wrote the letter. The trouble was that she was nervous. She had written 3 drafts already and torn them all up. On the 4th draft, she was moving quickly, trying to get the words down before she talked herself out of it again. And when she wrote the name on the envelope, she made a mistake she did not notice until she had already sealed it with wax. She had written Marcus Winston instead of Marcus Winslow, just 1 letter off, just 2 letters transposed. She stared at it for a long moment, weighing whether to open it and reseal it or write a new envelope. But her aunt called from downstairs, and then there was the matter of the stew, and before she knew it, the letter was in the postman's bag and on its way west, and Nora told herself it probably would not matter because he would know who it was meant for. What she did not know was that in Copperfield, New Mexico territory, there was no Marcus Winston. There was only Marcus Winslow, who was a fair and thoughtful man, and who, when the postmaster handed him a letter addressed to one Marcus Winston with a note from old Pete Aldridge, the postmaster saying he reckoned this was probably meant for Marcus, had stood on the dusty wooden sidewalk outside the post office in the bright March sun and read it 3 times through. Marcus Winslow was 31 years old and built along the lines of a man who had spent his whole life in outdoor labor, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were rough from rope and fence posts, and the kind of work that did not stop because the weather was bad. He had brown hair that went a little lighter in summer from the sun, and he had the sort of face that was not handsome in a theatrical way but that wore well, the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. He had clear gray eyes and a mouth that was usually held in a serious expression, but which softened entirely when something genuinely amused him. He had come out to New Mexico from Missouri when he was 22, following his older brother Daniel, who had come out 2 years before that, and he had worked another man's cattle for 4 years before he had saved enough to buy his own land, and he had been building his ranch, the Winslow Spread, for 5 years now. He had placed the advertisement in several Eastern newspapers in February, not out of desperation, but out of a calm and considered understanding that the ranch needed a woman's presence in it to become a home, and that he was not likely to find one in Copperfield, which had a population of about 340 souls and exactly 4 unmarried women, 3 of whom were already promised and one of whom was Widow Greer, who was 67 and had made clear she had no interest in a 4th husband. He had received 11 letters. He had read all of them carefully. Some were pleasant but clearly written by women who had no real conception of what frontier life entailed, and who seemed to be marrying geography more than they were marrying a man. Some were practical to the point of being dry, which he did not hold against them, but which gave him little to go on in terms of imagining a life together. 2 had been promising. And then there was the letter with the wrong name on the envelope. He almost did not open it. If old Pete had not attached his little note, Marcus might have set it aside, but he opened it. Nora's letter was not the longest of the 11. It was not the most elegant, but it was the most honest. She wrote that she was 24 and unmarried, that she had grown up working in a boarding house and knew how to manage a household under conditions that were not always comfortable, that she was in good health and could cook and sew, and was not afraid of animals. She wrote that she was not sure she could describe her character accurately because she suspected people rarely could, but that she would try. She said she was stubborn when she believed she was right, which her aunt said was her most frustrating quality, but that she was also a good listener, and she did not hold grudges because she had found that grudges were heavier than they looked. She said she had never been West, but that she had always wanted to be, and not in the romantic way that people said they wanted things they never actually pursued, but in the way that felt like an ache she could not locate but could not ignore. She said she was not looking for a fairy tale. She said she was looking for something real. Marcus read that last part twice. Something real. He folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat and rode back to the ranch, and that evening he sat at his kitchen table with a lamp and wrote back. His letter was also honest. He told her that he had noticed the name on the envelope. He told her he did not know any Marcus Winston, and therefore he supposed the letter was meant for him, and that close enough seemed like a reasonable standard to apply when the content of a letter was as straightforward and appealing as hers had been. He told her about the ranch, more than he had put in the advertisement. He told her about the land, the way it rolled out toward the mountains in the east and dropped into flat desert scrubland in the west, the way the sky at sunset was a color he had never seen anywhere else. He told her about the cattle, that he had 120 head now and was hoping to expand. He told her about his brother Daniel, who lived 12 miles north and came for dinner on Sundays. He told her about Copperfield, the good things and the less good things, because he thought she deserved an honest accounting. And at the end of the letter he said that if she was willing to consider making the journey west, he would be glad to meet her and see if what she had described in her letter was as real in person as it was on paper, and that he hoped she would not let the matter of a wrong name put her off writing back. At the bottom, before he signed it, he wrote, "Come west if you are willing. I think you might find it suits you." He signed it Marcus Winslow and underlined the last name twice, gently, so she would know for certain who she was dealing with. Nora received his letter on a gray April morning. She read it standing in the hallway, still in her coat from having just come in from the market, and she read it twice, and then she went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and read it a third time. She noticed the warmth in it, the careful way he had described the land as though he wanted her to see it before she agreed to anything, the way he had addressed the wrong name business not with irritation or mockery, but with a kind of gentle humor. Close enough. She found herself smiling at the table where her lamp sat. She wrote back that same afternoon. She said she appreciated his forthrightness. She said she had indeed written the wrong name, and she was embarrassed about it, but she was glad he had been magnanimous. She asked him 3 questions. She asked what his daily life looked like from sunrise to sunset. She asked what he expected of a wife in terms of the running of the household versus the running of the ranch. And she asked whether he was a man who could hold a conversation in the evenings, or whether he preferred silence, because she had nothing against silence, but she did like words. He answered all 3 questions in detail over the course of a letter that was 4 pages long, and which arrived in Millhaven in early May. His daily life was early and physical and varied, he said, and he wrote it out hour by hour in a way that was neither boastful nor discouraging, just honest. He said his expectation of a wife was that they would work as partners, that the house and the immediate surroundings of it were as much her domain as his, but that frontier life sometimes required everyone to do whatever needed doing regardless of whose domain it technically was, and he hoped that was acceptable. And for the 3rd question he said, with what Nora recognized as very careful self-awareness, that he had been told he was a man of few words, but that he thought the more accurate description was that he spoke when he had something worth saying. He said that with the right person he had been known to go on at some length. He said she would have to judge for herself once she arrived which category he fell into. Once she arrived. He said it as though it were already decided, and perhaps it was. Because Nora sat with that letter for 3 days, and on the 4th day she went downstairs and told her Aunt Frances that she was going west to marry a man named Marcus Winslow, and her aunt had put down her mending and looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Is he a good man?" And Nora thought about all 4 pages of that letter and said, "I believe he is." Her aunt had nodded slowly. "Then you had better go before you talk yourself out of it." The preparations took 5 weeks. Nora packed what she could fit into a trunk and a leather traveling bag. Her good dress and her working dresses, her boots, her mother's Bible, her sewing kit, 3 novels she could not bear to leave behind, a small framed photograph of herself that her aunt insisted she bring so Marcus would have something to look at while he was waiting. She sold her few pieces of jewelry that had any value, and her aunt gave her $20 from a coffee tin under the kitchen floorboard and told her it was for emergencies. She wrote 1 more letter to Marcus telling him her intended travel date. He wrote back within a week with the name of the hotel in Copperfield where she should stay upon arrival, and said he would meet her at the stage depot on whatever day she came through, or if the stage was delayed, every day until she arrived. Every day until she arrived. She folded that letter and kept it in her coat pocket the whole journey west. The journey was 4 days by train from Columbus to St. Louis, then another train to Albuquerque, and then a 2-day stagecoach ride to Copperfield. It was the longest journey Nora had ever taken, and it was exhausting and exhilarating in almost equal measure. The landscape changed so dramatically and so gradually that she kept expecting it to stop, kept expecting it to look familiar again, but it never did. By the time she was through the Kansas flats and into the New Mexico territory, she was pressed against the stage window like a child, watching the land open up in all directions into something she did not have adequate words for, vast and red-brown and ancient, with mountain ranges rising in the far distance, and the sky above it all enormous and almost aggressively blue. She arrived in Copperfield on a Friday afternoon in early June. The town was small but not sorry for itself, which she appreciated. There was a proper main street with a hotel and a general store and a bank and a saloon and a post office and several other establishments, all of them wooden-fronted and dusty, the hitching posts out front occupied by horses and mules. The stage rocked to a stop in front of the depot, and the door swung open and Nora climbed down with her traveling bag and stood blinking in the afternoon sun, which was nothing like Ohio sun. It was hotter and more direct and full of a particular quality of light that seemed to press everything into high relief. She looked around the depot. He was already there. She knew him immediately, not from any description he had given because he had not described himself much, but because of the way he was standing. He was leaning against a post at the edge of the depot platform, hat in hand, watching the stage with the careful attention of someone who was trying not to look too eager and was not entirely succeeding. He was tall, broader than she had imagined from the letters, with the kind of easy physical confidence that came from years of outdoor work. He had brown hair and clear gray eyes, and when those eyes found her across the platform, something happened in his expression that she could not quite name, a kind of settling, as though a piece had moved into its correct position. He crossed to her and stopped a few feet away and said, "Miss Hale." His voice was lower than she had expected and calm, a voice that had spent time in open spaces. "Mr. Winslow," she said, and was embarrassed to find her own voice slightly unsteady. He looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved. "I was going to say that you look exactly like your photograph, but I realize I did not send one of myself, so you have the advantage." She was startled into a laugh, a real one, not polite. "My aunt suggested I bring the photograph. She said you would need something to look at while waiting." "Your aunt sounds like a practical woman." "She is the most practical woman I have ever known. I hope I have inherited some of it." He reached out and took her trunk from the stage driver, lifting it with no particular effort, and gestured for her to come with him. "I have arranged for your things to go to the hotel. Mrs. Bellamy runs it, and she is a kind woman. I thought we might get dinner this evening, if you are not too tired from the journey, and talk properly. We have had a good deal of correspondence, but there is something to be said for a conversation that does not have to wait 2 weeks for an answer." Nora fell into step beside him and felt the heat of the afternoon sun on her shoulders and the strange firm reality of the ground beneath her feet. She had been traveling for the better part of a week. She was dusty and tired, and her back ached. And she felt, with a certainty she had not expected this soon, that she was somewhere she was supposed to be. "I would like that very much," she said. Dinner at the hotel dining room was simple but good. A roasted chicken with corn and biscuits and coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. They sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and the conversation moved easily, more easily than she had dared hope. He was not a rapid talker, but he was a thorough one, and she found that the letters had been an accurate preview of him. He listened the way some people did not, without fidgeting or half preparing his next comment, with his full attention, and when he said something he meant it and did not decorate it unnecessarily. He asked her about the journey, and she told him in more detail than she expected to, describing the landscape changes as she had observed them, the way the light had been different in each new territory. He listened with what she could only describe as affectionate recognition, like a man hearing someone else describe a person he loved. "It gets you," he said quietly. "The land. I remember coming through here for the first time and feeling like I had been looking at the world through a closed window for 22 years and someone had finally opened it." She looked at him across the table. "That is exactly what it felt like," she said. "Exactly that." He looked back at her, and something passed between them that was more than just the recognition of a shared metaphor. After dinner, he walked her to the base of the hotel stairs and stood with his hat in his hands and said, in the careful way he seemed to approach important things, "I want to be straightforward with you about something. I know this is an unusual situation. You have come a very long way on the basis of some letters from a man you have never met, and I do not take that lightly. I want you to know that whatever you decide, Whether you find that this is right or whether you find that it is not, I will make sure you have what you need. If you decide you want to go home, I will pay for your journey back." She looked at him steadily. "You paid for my journey here as well," she said. "That is a considerable expense for something that might not work out." "It seemed only fair," he said, "since you are the one doing most of the risk-taking." She considered that. It was honest and it was generous and it was, she thought, characteristic. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I did not come this far to run at the first uncertainty. I would like to stay and see." He nodded slowly, a nod that contained more relief than he probably intended to show. "Then I will come tomorrow morning and take you out to see the ranch if that suits you." "It suits me very well," she said. She lay awake that night in the small, clean room at Mrs. Bellamy's hotel, listening to the sounds of Copperfield settling into nighttime, the distant noise from the saloon 3 buildings down, the whicker of a horse on the street below, the strange and total darkness of a sky with fewer lights than she was accustomed to, and more stars than she had thought was possible. She thought about Marcus Winslow standing at the bottom of the stairs with his hat in his hands, being careful and fair and honest, and she thought that she had not been wrong about him. He came at 9 the next morning with 2 horses, a sturdy bay mare for her and his own horse, a dark brown quarter horse named Colt that was, Marcus told her with the first real unprompted smile she had seen from him, badly named in that he was 8 years old and therefore no longer a colt by any reasonable definition, but the name had stuck. She was a competent rider, having learned on her uncle's farm as a girl, and she told him so, and he looked mildly relieved. They rode out of Copperfield heading east, into the land she had seen from the stage window, and it was even more extraordinary up close, the red earth and the scrub brush, and the way the mountains rose in the distance like something painted, and the air clean and dry with a smell she could not identify but which she would later understand was the particular mineral smell of desert country under big sky. The Winslow Ranch sat on a gentle rise that gave it views in 3 directions, east toward the mountains and south and north across the scrubland. The house was a solid adobe structure, larger than she had expected, 2 main rooms on the ground level and a sleeping loft above, with a proper kitchen attached and a porch running across the front that had 2 chairs on it. There was a barn and a series of corrals and a well with a hand pump. The cattle were pastured to the south. It was not an elegant property, but it was a real one, thoughtfully built, and Nora stood on the porch and looked out at the view and felt something in her chest expand. "It needs some work inside," Marcus said from beside her, with the slight stiffness of a man showing someone something he has worked hard on and cannot be sure they will see it the way he does. "I have been meaning to fix the window frame in the kitchen, and there is a corner of the loft that needs replastering. I keep adding things to the list." "It is wonderful," she said, and meant it completely. He looked at her sideways. "You have not seen inside yet." "Show me inside then." The inside was clean if sparse. He had made efforts she could see. There were curtains on the main room windows, plain blue cotton, and the floor had been recently swept, and there was a proper iron stove in the kitchen that was in good condition. The furniture was simple and handmade, a table and chairs, a settle near the stone fireplace, a shelf with some books on it. She went to the books and looked at the titles. History, some practical references about animal husbandry and land management, a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe, and tucked at the end, a small volume of poetry that looked considerably more worn than the others. She pulled out the poetry and looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had not quite calculated that she would notice that particular book, a brief flash of something that might have been embarrassment. "My mother's," he said, which was honest but she suspected was also not the whole answer. She put it back carefully. "You know," she said, "in your letters you described yourself as a man who only spoke when he had something worth saying, but you wrote me 4 pages once." "I had something worth saying," he said, and this time the smile was not brief at all. They ate lunch in the kitchen, cold biscuits he had brought from town, and some dried beef and coffee he made on the stove, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table and continued the conversation that had begun the previous evening, moving through the practical and into the less practical with equal ease. He wanted to know about Ohio, about her life there, and she told him with the kind of frankness that she had perhaps never quite managed with people she had known for years. She told him about Thomas Garrett, which she had not planned to do, but it came out naturally in the course of explaining why she had answered the advertisement. She told it plainly, without bitterness, just as a thing that had happened that had changed the direction of her thinking. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done he said quietly, "He was a fool." She looked up. "I do not know. I think he was just honest, at least eventually. It would have been worse if he had married me anyway and been miserable." Marcus looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "but he was still a fool." She felt warmth move through her at that and looked down at her coffee cup to avoid showing it. They talked about the ranch and what a day in her life would look like here, and he was honest that it would be different from anything she had known. The closest neighboring woman was a Mrs. Elena Vasquez who lived 3 miles west with her husband and 4 children, and she was a good neighbor and would be a resource for Nora in the early weeks. The town was 12 miles, and a round trip by wagon was a half-day commitment. She would need to learn some things she did not know. He would help her learn them. "I am a quick study," she told him. "I believe it," he said. She stayed another 3 days at Mrs. Bellamy's hotel, and each day Marcus came and they spent hours together. The second day in town so she could see Copperfield properly and meet some of the people, and the third day back at the ranch where he showed her how the cattle operation worked, and she met Daniel, his brother, who had ridden over unexpectedly and turned out to be 3 years older than Marcus, shorter and more immediately talkative, with an open, friendly face and the same gray eyes. Daniel shook her hand and then gave Marcus a look over her shoulder that contained a remarkable amount of information in a very small moment. On the 4th morning, Marcus came to the hotel, and they sat in the small front parlor that Mrs. Bellamy maintained for guests, and he put his hat on his knee and said that he wanted to ask her something if she was willing to hear it. She said she was. He said that in his observation over these past several days, she was exactly what her letters had suggested she would be, and more. He said that he had found her easy to talk to, and that he respected the way she thought about things, and that she was someone he believed he could build a good life with, if she was willing to try. He said he knew it was not the most romantic of proposals, but that he was not much given to speeches, and he would rather be honest than eloquent. He said if she agreed they would arrange to be married by the local preacher before the week was out. Nora sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at this man who had answered a letter with the wrong name on it, and had been kind and careful and genuinely interested in her from the very first exchange, and she said yes. The wedding was small. It took place at the Copperfield Church on a Saturday morning in mid-June 1882. The preacher was a stout, cheerful man named Reverend Hollis, who had been marrying people in Copperfield for 15 years, and who conducted the ceremony with brisk warmth. Daniel stood at Marcus's side. Mrs. Bellamy and Elena Vasquez, who had come in with her husband Rodrigo for the occasion, sat in the front pew. Nora wore her good dress, ivory cotton with lace at the collar, and she had done her hair as nicely as she could manage. And when Marcus turned to look at her as she walked the short aisle to where he stood, his expression was something she was not sure she had words for yet, serious and intent and lit from somewhere underneath. He said his vows in a clear, steady voice, and when he put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he had ordered from a jeweler in Albuquerque, his hand was steady and his eyes did not leave hers. She said her vows in a voice that was clear and only slightly unsteady, and she meant every word with the full weight of herself. When Reverend Hollis said that Marcus could kiss his bride, Marcus looked at her for just a moment, the briefest pause, and then he leaned in and kissed her gently, just once, his hand at her jaw, and it was brief but it was real, And when he pulled back, his eyes were quiet and warm, and she understood that she had not made a mistake. They had a small celebration lunch at the hotel dining room. Alina's husband Rodrigo telling stories about the early days of the territory in a rolling bilingual delivery that had everyone at the table laughing, and Daniel making a toast that was warm and slightly embarrassing to Marcus and completely genuine. Then Nora went upstairs and changed into her traveling dress, and they loaded her trunk into Marcus's wagon and drove the 12 miles to the ranch in the late afternoon sun, side by side on the wagon seat, talking easily and not needing to fill all the silence. The ranch looked different when she drove up to it as a wife rather than a visitor. It looked like hers. The first weeks were full and demanding in a way that Nora found she liked. There was a great deal to learn, and she attacked it with the focused energy that had always been how she handled new things. Alina Vasquez proved to be everything Marcus had promised, a generous and knowledgeable neighbor who spoke English and Spanish with equal fluency, and who showed Nora the specifics of desert cooking, how to manage a wood stove in the extreme heat, where to source the best provisions in Copperfield, and how to tell from the sky when a dust storm was coming, which Nora would later describe as one of the most useful skills she ever acquired. Marcus was patient with her learning curve and never made her feel insufficient for not knowing things that this country required and her previous life had not prepared her for. He would show her something once, clearly and completely, and then let her do it, and if she did it wrong, he would tell her what to adjust without making it feel like a failure. She came to understand that this was characteristic of him, this way of teaching without diminishing, and she valued it more every time she encountered it. They worked alongside each other from morning to evening most days, and in those long working hours she learned him in the way that the ordinary flow of a shared life teaches people. She learned that he was most himself in the early morning before the full heat of the day, that he drank his coffee without sugar, that he had an instinctive and respectful relationship with animals that was different from mere practicality, that he could read the land the way she could read a person's face. She learned that he had opinions he held strongly, but that he listened to the other side first, and sometimes, if the argument was good enough, he changed his mind, and he would say so plainly rather than pretending he had not. She learned that he had been lonely, though he would not have described it that way himself. It was visible in small things, the way he arranged the table for two and seemed slightly surprised each time as though he was still getting used to it, the way he talked to the horses more than strictly necessary, the way he watched her sometimes in the evenings when she was reading, with an expression of quiet contentment that she thought might be the face of someone who had stopped expecting something and then received it. She was not in love with him those first weeks. She was not sure yet what she was. She liked him deeply and felt safe with him and found him more interesting each day. But she held the word love with care because she did not want to apply it before it was true. She thought he was doing the same. They had married as strangers with good intentions, and they were becoming something else, and she thought it was important to let that happen at its own speed rather than trying to rush it. The first real crisis came about 3 weeks into their marriage. One of the steers got into a section of scrubland near the southeast border of the property and went down in a gully, and Marcus spent 6 hours in the brutal afternoon heat getting the animal out with ropes and considerable physical effort. He came back to the house late in the afternoon with a cut on his forearm from a wire fence and a bruised shoulder from where the animal had kicked during the extraction, and he looked tired in a way she had not seen before, flat and depleted. She did not fuss at him. She heated water and cleaned the cut efficiently, and gave him the dinner she had already prepared and poured him coffee and sat across from him while he ate and asked him practical questions about the southeast fence line and what needed to be done to prevent it happening again. He looked up at her from his coffee and said, "You are very good at this." "At what?" she asked. "Not making a person feel worse about a bad day than the day already has." She considered this. You are tired and you are in some pain and the steer is presumably all right. There does not seem to be anything in that situation that requires me to add to the difficulty." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was starting to recognize as his version of being moved, which was subtle but which she had become able to read. "No," he said quietly. "There does not." The cut healed without trouble. But that evening, while she was washing the dinner dishes and he was sitting at the table cleaning a bridle, she asked him about his parents and he told her about them. His father, who had been a farmer in Missouri and a fair man if not an expressive one, and his mother, who had read to him, and Daniel from whatever books she could get, and who had died when Marcus was 19 from a long illness that had taken 2 years to complete its work. He talked about it without self-pity, but with the particular quiet that surrounded things that had shaped a person deeply. Nora dried her hands on her apron and sat down across from him and told him about her own mother, how she had been a laughing woman who made the boarding house feel like something more than it was, and how the house had been different after she was gone, not bad exactly, but with a dimension missing. They sat there in the kitchen for 2 hours in the lamplight talking about their mothers, and it was the first time she cried in front of him, not a great deal. Just a few tears she brushed away matter-of-factly, and he reached across the table and put his hand over hers without saying anything, and she turned her hand over and held his. The summer deepened. June gave way to July and July to August, and the heat became something almost solid, a presence in the air rather than just a quality of it. Nora adapted faster than she had expected. She tanned from the sun, her hands roughened from work, and she developed the particular efficiency of movement that people acquired in hot climates, not slow exactly but careful, conserving energy. She planted a kitchen garden on the sheltered north side of the house, where Elena told her the soil held water better, and she had some success with tomatoes and onions and herbs. She learned to make the most of the cool hours of early morning and late evening, and to accept the midday heat as simply the terms of the land. She rode out with Marcus on some mornings, when the work permitted it. He was teaching her the property in sections, showing her the boundaries and the water sources and the best grazing areas, explaining the logic of how he managed the land with a thoroughness that told her he considered it as much hers to know as his. She paid close attention and asked intelligent questions, and he answered them with the same directness. One morning in late July, they rode out to the eastern edge of the property, where the land rose slightly toward the mountain foothills and the air was a few degrees cooler, and she stopped her horse and looked east at the mountains, which were turning blue-purple in the early light, and she felt something so full and right that she had to stay still for a moment to hold it. Marcus stopped beside her and looked at the mountains and then at her. "What is it?" he asked. "I was thinking about the letter," she said. "About writing the wrong name and not knowing until it was too late to fix it." He waited. "And I was thinking that it was the best mistake I ever made," she said. She was not looking at him. She was still looking at the mountains. But she heard the change in his breathing. The very small alteration that she had learned meant something had landed somewhere important. "It was a good mistake," he agreed, and his voice was quieter than usual. She finally turned and looked at him, and he was watching her with those clear gray eyes, and the sun was just coming up over the mountain ridge, and the light was hitting his face, and she thought, with a certainty that did not require announcement, that she was in love with this man. She did not say so, not then. It did not feel like the right moment for words. But she held it in her chest all the way back to the ranch and for the rest of the day, and that evening when they sat on the porch in the last of the daylight and he was reading and she was mending a seam in one of his work shirts, she said, without looking up from her sewing, "Marcus," he said, not looking up from his book, "I am very glad I came west." He was quiet for a moment. Then he put the book down and looked at her, and she looked up and met his eyes, and he said, in the careful way he said important things, "I am very glad you wrote the wrong name." And then he smiled, a full and genuine smile that she had learned was not given easily and was therefore worth more for the rarity, and she laughed a little and shook her head and went back to her mending, and the evening settled around them warm and complete. It was Daniel who finally pushed the rest of the way there, without meaning to. He came for Sunday dinner in early August as usual, and he brought a bottle of good whiskey and was in a sociable mood. And after dinner, when the dishes were cleared, he told a story about Marcus as a young man in Missouri, a story about a disastrous attempt to impress a girl at a county fair that had involved a runaway pig and the destruction of 2 prize vegetable displays. And Nora laughed until she had to press her napkin to her eyes while Marcus sat with his arms folded and the expression of a man enduring something he could not stop. "You might have warned her about the storytelling," Marcus said to Daniel. "Where would be the fun in that?" Daniel said comfortably. And Nora looked at Marcus across the table, at his expression of rueful dignity, and felt such a rush of warmth for him that she could not have kept it off her face if she had tried. Daniel noticed. He had sharp eyes behind his easy manner. He caught Nora's eye and grinned and said nothing at all, and she liked him enormously in that moment. After Daniel left that evening and they had cleaned up, and the ranch was quiet around them, Nora came downstairs from the loft where she had gone to get her shawl for the cooler evening air, and Marcus was in the main room banking the fire. She came and stood beside him, and he straightened, and they stood there in the low firelight for a moment, and she looked up at him and said, "I love you." She had not planned to say it right then, but it was true, and she was a direct person, and she did not see the point of holding the true thing inside when it wanted to come out. He looked at her, and she watched the expression move through his face in layers, the first quick flash of something almost startled, and then the settling of it, the recognition of it, and then something she could only call luminous, a quiet and serious radiance. "Nora," he said, and the way he said her name made it clear enough. But he said the rest of it too. "I love you, I have for a while. I did not want to say it before I was certain you felt the same way, and I was not certain enough." "And now," she said. "Now I am certain," he said. She stepped toward him, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood like that in front of the dying fire for a long time, and she felt the solidness of him, the actual physical reality of this man who had written back to a letter with the wrong name on it and said close enough, "Come west." And she thought that of all the things that had ever happened to her, this was the one she would not trade. He kissed her properly that night, in the way he had been careful not to rush, and she kissed him back, and the tenderness of it was something she had not been prepared for, this man who was so capable and practical being also so gentle. September brought cooler nights and a shift in the quality of the light, and with it came a problem that was neither dramatic nor easy. A man named Colton Briggs, who owned a competing cattle operation 30 miles south, had been encroaching on a water source that sat on the edge of the Winslow property. It was a seasonal creek that ran along the southeast boundary, the same area where the steer had gotten into trouble in July, and the water rights to it had been formally established in Marcus's deed, but Briggs had apparently decided to dispute the boundary, and had been letting his men and cattle use the creek for the past several weeks. Marcus found out from a neighboring rancher named Holt, who had seen Briggs's cattle at the creek, and mentioned it in passing at the Copperfield General Store. Marcus came home that afternoon with the same flat look he'd had after the steer rescue, but this one had an edge under it. He explained the situation to Nora over dinner, and she listened carefully and then asked the practical questions first: what exactly the deed said, who in Copperfield would be the authority on land disputes, whether Briggs was known to be the kind of man who would respond to a legal challenge or only to other pressures. Marcus answered each question. The deed was clear on the water rights. The Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe was the formal authority, but the local land agent in Copperfield, a man named Grant Sayers, had the authority to review and confirm boundaries in the field, which was generally faster. Briggs was known to be a man who pushed until he met something that pushed back. Then you push back, Nora said, but through Sayers first. You document it formally so that you have standing if it goes further. He looked at her across the table. You have thought about this kind of thing before, he said. I grew up in a boarding house. There were always disputes about rooms and money and who owed what. The principle is the same. You want the official record on your side before you do anything that looks like a confrontation. He nodded slowly. Yes, he said. That is exactly right. He went to see Grant Sayers in Copperfield the following week, and Sayers came out to the property and walked the southeast boundary and confirmed in writing that the creek was entirely within the Winslow deed. Marcus rode to see Briggs himself after that, with a copy of Sayers's written confirmation in his coat, and the conversation, by Marcus's account when he came home, was brief and not friendly, but it was conclusive. Briggs had looked at the documentation and made his dissatisfaction clear in language that was colorful if not constructive, and then said his men would stay off the creek. Nora asked Marcus that evening whether he thought Briggs would actually honor it. For now, Marcus said, he is a man who respects what he cannot easily take. As long as we make it clear we are watching, he will leave it alone. It was not a perfect resolution, but it was a stable one, and Nora understood that in the territory at this time, a stable, imperfect resolution was often the best that was available. The injustices of the land claim era were real and pervasive, with large operations constantly pressing against smaller ones, and the legal system often slow to respond and sometimes easy to influence. She was glad Marcus had the standing and the documentation he did. There were ranchers around them who did not have either. The fall was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She had thought Ohio autumn was the standard of the season, but the New Mexico territory in September and October was its own particular phenomenon, the light going golden and sideways across the land, the mountains turning colors she had not known mountains could be, the air clean and sharp with altitude. She and Marcus rode out most mornings when they could spare the time, and sometimes in the late afternoons they sat on the porch together and watched the sunset do things to the sky that ought to have required a larger vocabulary than she possessed to describe adequately. She wrote to her Aunt Frances every week. Her aunt wrote back faithfully, long letters full of boarding house news and Ohio weather, and the occasional piece of wisdom delivered in her aunt's characteristic dry fashion. In one letter, her aunt wrote that she was glad Nora had gone, that she had always seemed too large for the boarding house in the way that plants sometimes grew in the wrong size pot, and that the West clearly suited her. Nora read that letter to Marcus one evening, and he said that her aunt was a perceptive woman, and Nora said she would pass that along. In October, Nora realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for about 2 weeks before she was certain enough to say anything, and when she was certain she told Marcus on a quiet morning when they were both in the kitchen, he drinking his first coffee and she turning the eggs in the pan. She turned from the stove and said, simply, that she believed she was going to have a baby, that by her reckoning it would come in the spring. Marcus set his coffee cup down very carefully, as though he was afraid of breaking something, and then he stood and crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then held her against him for a long moment, saying nothing, which was its own very complete kind of eloquence. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "Just certain now that I had been suspecting for a bit. You should not be doing the heavy work," he started. "Marcus," she said firmly, "women have babies on frontier ranches. I will be sensible about what I do, but I am not made of china." He looked at her, and she could see him weighing the argument, and then he said, "You are much more valuable than china." "Then trust me to know my own limits," she said. He did trust her. He was careful without being suffocating, which she appreciated enormously. He took over the tasks that were genuinely heavy and adjusted their workload with quiet practicality. He wrote to Daniel, who came over the following Sunday with his own quiet delight evident in every line of him, and who toasted them both with the good whiskey, and said that he had better get started on being the best uncle in the territory, which was a significant title to aim for, and he intended to pursue it with appropriate dedication. Elena Vasquez was invaluable through the winter months. She had delivered 4 children herself in this country, and she had a calm and knowledgeable authority about all things related to pregnancy and birth that Nora leaned on gratefully. They developed a friendship that was one of the true gifts of the territory for Nora, genuine and warm, and based on mutual respect. 2 practical women from very different backgrounds finding themselves neighbors in the same vast and demanding landscape. The winter itself was milder than Ohio winters, but had its own challenges. The cold nights requiring the stove to be fed carefully through the hours of darkness, the water pump outside requiring more work in the cold. Marcus and Nora spent more time indoors together by the fire in the evenings, and these were some of the times she loved best, the particular quality of a long evening in a warm house with nothing required of them but to be present with each other. He had started reading aloud to her in the evenings, history, and sometimes the poetry from his mother's worn volume, which she had found she loved, and she read back to him from her novels when he was willing, which he increasingly was. They talked about everything in those evenings. About the ranch's future, the expansion he was planning for the spring, new fencing and additional cattle, possibly a hired hand for the summer when the work would increase. About the baby, what the birth would look like and what they would need. About larger things, the territory and what it was becoming, the changes coming as the railroads pushed further west and towns like Copperfield grew and changed. She told him her thoughts about things, and he told her his, and they disagreed sometimes. Not sharply, but with the productive friction of 2 people who each had a good mind, and were not in the habit of simply deferring to the other. She found that she loved arguing with him almost as much as she loved agreeing with him. The arguments were always respectful and always landed somewhere that was more considered than where either of them had started. The baby came in April of 1883 on a night when the stars were extraordinary, and the air outside had the particular sweetness of early spring. Elena was there, and Marcus, and the labor was long but not cruel. And at 3 in the morning on an April Tuesday, the baby made his arrival into the world with a force of opinion that suggested he intended to be heard. He was a boy, solid and red-faced and vigorous, with a fuzz of dark hair, and when he finally stopped yelling enough to open his eyes, the gray eyes of his father, Marcus held him with the careful reverence of a man who was afraid of his own strength around something so small, and looked at his son's face with an expression that Nora, exhausted and moved beyond what words could easily manage, thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. James, Marcus said. It was the name they had agreed on after Marcus's father. James Thomas Winslow, Nora confirmed, adding Thomas for her own father, which she had decided some weeks ago, and which made Marcus nod with a quiet approval. James Thomas Winslow was a good baby, which Nora said was entirely to his credit, and she refused to take responsibility for it, and Marcus said that he suspected it would not last, which turned out to be partially accurate as the months went on. But those early months were a wonder, and watching Marcus with his son was one of the ongoing wonders of Nora's life. He was not a demonstrative man in public, but he was with James. He talked to him, and held him with a patience and gentleness that was entirely natural, and which made Nora love him in ways she had not previously had access to. Daniel was, as promised, an excellent uncle, appearing on Sundays with a regularity that became even more reliable after James arrived, bringing small carved wooden things he made himself, a horse, a bird, a small dog, and declaring himself the premier entertainment in James's limited world with an enthusiasm that James, once he was old enough to be entertained by anything, seemed to validate. The spring and summer of 1883 were busy and good. Marcus hired a ranch hand, a young man named Eli Chambers who was 20 years old and from Texas, quiet and industrious and good with the cattle, who lived in a small room added to the barn and who ate breakfast with them most mornings, and who treated Nora with a respectful formality that she found charming and unnecessary, but did not try to change because it seemed to be simply who he was. With Eli's help, the ranch operation expanded as Marcus had planned. The cattle herd grew. The fences were extended and improved. Marcus built Nora a better kitchen, adding space along the back wall and installing a larger stove that she had researched in a catalog, and which she declared a considerable improvement on the original. Nora started a small lending library from the books she had brought west and those she ordered from Albuquerque. Several of the women in the area began coming by on the first Saturday of each month when the Winslows hosted what started as an informal gathering and became, over the next year, a regular fixture. Elena brought her sister-in-law. Two women from the Copperfield side of things began making the ride out. Marcus had built an extra table for the porch, and on the first Saturday of each month he and Eli made themselves scarce with exaggerated gallantry, and the porch became a meeting place for a group of women who discussed books and swapped knowledge and were honest with each other in ways that were not always easy or comfortable and were always valuable. Marcus asked her once what they talked about at those meetings, genuinely curious. She told him. History and fiction and the practical realities of frontier life. The ways the law did not always serve women well in the territory. What they wanted their children to know and how they were going to teach it. The things they missed from wherever they had come from and the things they would not trade away. He listened to all of it seriously. The thing about the law, he said, you are right that it does not always serve women well. It does not always serve anyone who is not already powerful very well. No, she said, but we can at least see it clearly for what it is. You can, he said, and then you can decide what to do about it. She looked at him. Is that an encouragement? It is an observation, he said, and then more quietly, and an encouragement. In 1884, Copperfield grew. The railroad came within 30 miles of the town, which changed the economics of everything, cattle prices and supply lines, and the general pace of commerce. More people arrived, some of them good additions and some less so, and the town acquired a new doctor, which Nora and Elena both agreed was one of the more useful arrivals. The doctor's name was Hugh Calloway, a young man from Philadelphia who had come west for reasons he described as a desire for useful practice rather than comfortable practice, and who turned out to be both competent and genuinely committed to the community, which was not as obvious a combination as one might hope. James was walking by then, a determined and somewhat precarious toddler who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and an opinion about everything, expressed at volume. He followed Marcus around the ranch with a focus that was partly imitation and partly genuine fascination. And Marcus, who had once been a man of deliberate and economical movement, could regularly be found slowing his pace significantly to accommodate a small person who was learning what legs were for. It was about this time that Nora received a letter from Ohio that required more than the usual letter in return. Her Aunt Frances had fallen ill, not severely but enough to make clear that the boarding house was becoming more than she could manage alone. Nora sat with the letter for 2 days and then talked to Marcus. She told him plainly that she was worried, that her aunt was the only close family she had left in Ohio, and that she did not know what to do about it. She was not asking permission, she was thinking aloud, and he knew her well enough to understand the difference. He thought about it for a day and then came to her with a proposal. He had money set aside from the good cattle year that he had been planning to use for expansion, but the expansion could wait a season. He suggested that Nora write to ask her aunt whether she would be willing to come west. Nora had not considered this. She stared at him. Frances is 61 years old, she said. Your letters tell me she is stubborn and practical, he said. The boarding house in Millhaven is declining. The West is not declining, and you need her. She wrote the letter. Her aunt's response came 3 weeks later and began with the sentence, I have been waiting for you to suggest this for a year. Frances Hale arrived in Copperfield in October of 1884, on the same stage route Nora had taken 2.5 years before, and she stepped off the stage and looked around Copperfield with the sharp, assessing eye of a woman who had managed a boarding house for 30 years and said, "Smaller than I thought. Good bones, though." Marcus had driven the wagon in to meet her. He helped her down from the stage step, and she looked him up and down in the direct way that was her characteristic, and then said, "Well, you look like what you said you were in your letters." "I try to," Marcus said, and she laughed, which Nora had privately suspected was the hurdle she needed to clear first. Frances settled into the spare room off the main room downstairs, which Marcus had quietly spent 2 weeks improving before her arrival, with a new window and a better door and a proper shelf for her things. She was in the country of old woman rather than elderly, still vigorous and direct, and she was useful from the first week, managing the house with an efficiency that freed Nora for other things, and establishing herself as a grandmother figure for James with a thoroughness that James found entirely agreeable. She also told Nora, on the second Sunday after her arrival when they were washing dishes together, while Marcus and Daniel sat on the porch and James transferred dirt from one place to another in the yard with great concentration, that Marcus Winslow was a better man than Nora had had any right to hope for from a letter with the wrong name on the envelope. "I know," Nora said. "You should tell him that more," Frances said. "I tell him quite frequently," Nora said. "Good," Frances said. "Men need to hear it, even when they pretend they do not." That winter was one of the coldest in recent memory for the territory, which meant it was not as cold as an Ohio winter, but it was cold enough to require attention, and the ranch operations contracted to the essential as they always did in the cold months. Frances adapted to the stove with a speed that impressed even Alina. She and Alina, who began visiting more often once she found someone in the house worth visiting, developed a friendship over tea and practical conversation that Nora found both touching and amusing. Two very different women who understood each other perfectly on the subjects that mattered. Marcus and Nora had their most serious disagreement that winter. It was about the Vasquez family. Rodrigo Vasquez had been ill through November, and the illness had become serious by December, a lung ailment that Dr. Calloway treated with what the time and medicine permitted, but which was not yielding fast. The Vasquez ranch was struggling, with Alina managing alone with help from her eldest son, who was only 14. Marcus wanted to give them one of Eli's time in the weeks where the Winslow cattle needed less attention, to send Eli over to help with the heavy work. Nora's disagreement was not with helping. She agreed entirely. Her disagreement was with the scale of it. She thought Marcus was proposing to give too little, and she said so. She said he should go himself, not Eli, because Rodrigo Vasquez was a neighbor and a friend, and 3 miles was not far, and a man who needed help deserved the help of someone who could make decisions, not a hired hand working alone. Marcus's counter-argument was that his own ranch needed him, and the winter work, while reduced, was not nothing. Nora said that they could both adjust what they were doing to cover the gap for a few weeks, that Frances was here now, and that she herself could handle more of the daily ranch management if he trusted her to do it. He looked at her for a long moment after she said that last part. "I trust you entirely," he said. "I have for a long time." "Then go help them," she said. He went. He spent 3 to 4 days a week at the Vasquez ranch through December and into January, and Nora managed the Winslow operation with Frances and Eli, and it was demanding, but it worked. And Rodrigo Vasquez recovered slowly through the winter with his family intact and his ranch held together. And in the spring, when he was on his feet again, he rode over to the Winslow ranch and sat on the porch and talked to Marcus for an hour. And when he left, Nora saw Marcus standing at the porch rail for a long moment before he came inside, and she did not ask what they had talked about because she could see it in his face, and she did not need to. Alina brought tamales the following Sunday and held Nora's hands for a long moment before she let go, and the look she gave her said everything. Spring of 1885. James was 2 years old and covering ground with an alarming speed and a complete absence of self-preservation instinct that kept Nora and Francis variously occupied. He had begun talking with great enthusiasm if limited clarity, and his best friend was the barn cat, a large orange animal of uncertain age named Governor by Eli, and who submitted to James's attentions with a patience that Nora privately thought exceeded the patience of most humans she had known. The ranch was good. The cattle were at 160 head now. The kitchen garden had expanded into a proper vegetable garden. The first Saturday of the month gatherings on the porch had grown to 9 regular attendees and had acquired a name. The women simply called it the Saturday, which Nora thought was perfectly sufficient. Marcus and Nora rode out to the eastern edge one morning in May, the anniversary of her arrival, and they sat their horses side by side looking at the mountains in the early light that turned them blue and gold. 3 years, she said. Almost 3, he said. 3 years ago I stepped off a stage into a town I had never seen to meet a man I had never met, because I had made a writing error. He looked at her with the warmth he did not always put into words, but which she had long since learned to read in every line of him. And now? She looked at the mountains and then at him, this man with gray eyes and a voice that had spoken her name into something tender from nearly the beginning. This man who had written back to a letter with the wrong name on it and said, "Come west," who had taught her the land and trusted her judgment and held her in the firelight and cried only once that she had seen, when James was born, and who made her feel every single day that she had come to the right place. And now I cannot imagine any version of my life that does not have this in it, she said. You and this land and this life. It is the only life I want. He reached out across the distance between their horses and she took his hand. I could not imagine any version of mine that had a life in it at all, he said quietly, until that letter arrived. She squeezed his hand and he held it, and the mountains turned gold in the rising sun, and the land stretched out around them familiar and vast and entirely theirs. They stayed on the rise for a long time, neither of them in a hurry to go back, talking about what they wanted for the coming year. He wanted to build up the north pasture fencing and try to bring in a few more horses. He had been thinking about breeding quarter horses as a secondary operation and had discussed it with Daniel, who was interested in going in on it jointly. She told him she had been thinking about whether there was any way to expand the Saturday gatherings, perhaps to bring in women from further out who did not have easy access to town, a longer meeting once a month that had a practical component, teaching skills that were hard to come by. He said that was a good idea and meant it. She said she had been corresponding with a woman in Santa Fe who was organizing efforts around women's literacy in the territory, and that she was interested in supporting that work, perhaps starting modestly with what was possible from Copperfield. He said that was also a good idea. That education was the thing that changed what was possible for people, and he had always believed it. She looked at him. You never said that quite so directly before. You never asked quite so directly before, he said, and besides, it is obvious from the way I stacked the books. She laughed. You stacked the books in a corner with a poetry volume hidden at the end. I did not hide it, he said. It was at the end because it is a small book. It was turned spine-in, she said. He looked at the mountains with great dignity. I do not recall the specific arrangement. She was still laughing when they turned the horses back toward the ranch. That summer Nora was expecting again, which she told Marcus on a warm July morning and which produced the same reaction as the first time, the careful setting down of something, the crossing of the room, the holding on. This time he also said, against her hair, that he hoped she was as well as she said. She was. The pregnancy was straightforward and she was experienced in it now, and Francis was there, which made everything easier. The Saturday gatherings continued. The horse breeding plan moved forward, Marcus and Daniel acquiring 2 good broodmares in the fall. Eli, who had turned 22, had met a girl in Copperfield, the daughter of the blacksmith, and was quietly and visibly happier than he had previously been, which Nora approved of and said so to Marcus, who said that he had noticed, and that if Eli was thinking about getting married, he had better give him a raise because a man supporting a wife needed more than he had been paying a single man. Nora said that was generous and also correct. Eli did propose in November, and the blacksmith's daughter, whose name was Rosie and who was 19 and direct and capable, said yes, and they married in December in Copperfield. Nora made a wedding gift of the novel she had always loved most from her 3 novels, inscribed on the inside front cover with a short sentence about how the best things sometimes started with unlikely circumstances, and Rosie read it and looked at Nora with eyes that understood exactly what was being said. The second baby arrived in February of 1886, another winter arrival, and this one came faster than James had, arrived in a hurry as though impatient with the process, and was a girl, red-faced and strong-lunged like her brother had been, and with her mother's dark auburn hair visible already in the first soft fuzz. Marcus held his daughter and looked at Nora with an expression that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. Clara, they had agreed, for Marcus's mother. Clara Frances Winslow, for both their mothers in their ways, and Frances stood in the doorway of the bedroom and made a sound she quickly mastered, and said that the name suited perfectly. James, who was brought in to see his sister the following morning, stood at the bedside and looked at her for a long, solemn moment and then looked up at Nora and said, "Small." "She will get bigger," Nora told him. He appeared to find this an acceptable trajectory and reached out one careful finger to touch Clara's hand, and Clara's hand closed around it with the powerful automatic grip of a newborn, and James's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like recognition, and from that moment, he was her champion. The ranch grew. The years settled into a rhythm that was never boring because the land and the seasons and the work made boredom structurally impossible, and the community around them grew and shifted and required attention and gave back interest. Copperfield had a school by 1887, a proper one-room schoolhouse, and Nora contributed to the effort of establishing it with characteristic energy, and then sent James to it when he was old enough with a pride she did not try to temper. Daniel met a woman in 1887, a widow named Margaret who had come from Colorado and who had steel in her and humor, and who matched Daniel's sociability with a calm that suited them both perfectly. They married in the spring of 1888, and Marcus and Nora drove to Copperfield for the wedding, and Nora danced with Marcus for the first time, properly danced, at the wedding supper at the hotel, and he was not a practiced dancer, but he was willing, and she guided him through it with a patience that made him laugh at himself, and Daniel watched them from across the room and said something to Margaret that made her smile. Frances had good years in New Mexico. The dry air was better for her chest than Ohio had been, and the life suited her even at 60-something, because she was constitutionally unsuited to idleness. She ran the house with Nora, and they divided the domain with the easy equity of 2 people who respected each other completely. She was a fixture at the Saturday gatherings, contributing a dry and practical perspective that the younger women found both challenging and valuable. She taught James, and then Clara, to play cards, a skill Marcus pretended to disapprove of and clearly found amusing. She read to them in the evenings when Nora and Marcus were occupied, from whichever of Nora's books were suitable, and she had a gift for making the reading theatrical that the children adored. She died in the winter of 1892, quietly in her sleep, at 69 years old. She had lived 9 years in New Mexico, and she had told Nora in one of their last conversations that she did not regret a single one of them, and that Ohio had been fine but this had been better, and that the West suited everyone in the Hale family, which was evidently a matter of blood. Nora grieved her honestly and fully, and Marcus held her through the worst of it without trying to rush or fix it, And Alina came, and Daniel and Margaret came, and the Saturday women came. And Nora understood that she was held in a community that was real and had been built one choice and one connection at a time, and that was its own kind of comfort. The land went on. The seasons went on. James grew into a boy with a serious face and quick hands who was interested in everything, especially animals, and who was clearly heading toward a life that had something to do with the land he had been born into. Clara was her own thing entirely, bright and fierce with her mother's auburn hair and her father's way of being still and watching before she moved, and a laugh that came out of nowhere and lit up whatever room she was in. Marcus in his mid-40s was silver at his temples and slightly more lined in the face, but physically, he was still the man Nora had watched walk across a stage platform toward her in the bright June sun of 1882. And she told him so one evening when they were on the porch, and he said that she was flattering him, and she said she was stating facts, and she had always been a woman who stated facts. He looked at her in the last of the evening light, the gold light that the New Mexico sky did with such authority, and he said, "You know what I think about." "What?" she said. "That letter," he said, "that I almost did not open it because of the name." She considered that. "Why did you?" "Pete's note," he said. "He thought it was probably meant for me, and I thought the worst that happens is I open a letter that was not meant for me. And the best that happens is something I could not have told you then, but I can tell you now." "Tell me now then," she said. "The best that happens," he said, "is this." He gestured with one hand at the porch, the house, the land spreading out in the evening, and the gesture included her in it, she could see. She was part of this in a way that was not separate from the land and the house, but integral to all of it. All of this. She reached over and took his hand in both of hers, and held it the way she had that first year at the kitchen table when he had reached across in the lamplight. And the stars were beginning to come out above the mountains in the east, the same impossible density of them that had kept her awake her first night at Mrs. Bellamy's hotel in a different life. And she thought that she had written the wrong name on a letter, and the wrong name had led her exactly to where she was meant to be. "Close enough," she said quietly, the way he had written it in that first letter, "Come West." He looked at her, and the warmth in his gray eyes was everything, unhurried and complete. "Close enough," he agreed. And above them, the New Mexico sky went on doing what it had always done, spreading itself out vast and starlit and indifferent to human smallness in a way that was not cold but simply honest, because the West was always honest, and it asked the same in return. And Nora Hale Winslow, who had always been a woman who told the truth, was precisely where she was supposed to be. On a porch in the territory, with a man who had answered a letter with the wrong name on it, and never once seemed to think that was anything other than exactly what it was meant to be. Inside, James and Clara were in the main room with a lamp, James reading with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and Clara drawing horses on paper with a charcoal stick in her particular concentrated way. The ranch was quiet around them, the cattle settled in the south pasture, the horses in the corral. Colt had died the year before at the excellent age of 17, and Marcus had named his new horse Colt II with a complete absence of originality that Nora had pointed out, and he had defended on the grounds of tradition. Governor the Barn Cat had been succeeded by a cat named Governor II, the naming scheme apparently establishing itself as ranch policy. Eli and Rosie lived a mile down the road now in their own small house, Eli having become the foreman of the Winslow operation, and Rosie having become one of the Saturday regulars and one of Nora's closest friends. Daniel and Margaret had 2 children of their own now, 7-year-old twins, a boy and a girl, who were the particular chaos of Sunday dinners and who James treated with the patient authority of an older cousin, and Clara treated as acceptable playmates on the condition that they followed her rules, which they mostly did. The territory was changing. There was talk of statehood, which would come eventually. The railroad had gotten closer. Copperfield had grown from 340 souls to nearly 800, and there was a proper doctor and a lawyer now, and a post office that was larger than old Pete Aldridge's original operation, though Pete was still there, gray-haired and slightly slower, but fundamentally unchanged in his comfortable omniscience about the town's business. Nora's Saturday gatherings had evolved. Several of the women had been part of the effort to get a second teacher for the school, which had succeeded in 1890. Two had started a small women's cooperative for selling goods, quilts and canned preserves, that was modest but real and genuinely useful. The literacy work that Nora had corresponded about with the woman in Santa Fe had grown into something she was proud of. Not enormous but solid, real women who could read and write who could not before, real children who had books, real futures that were slightly larger for it. She thought sometimes in the big quiet way that a settled life allows for thinking, exactly the person she had wanted to become. Not finished, because she did not think people finished but genuine. Herself fully, in the way that a good life in the right place with the right person makes possible. Marcus squeezed her hand on the porch and she came back from her thoughts and looked at him. "Where did you go?" he asked. "Thinking," she said. "Good thoughts." "The best," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles in the way he had that was entirely his own, a gesture that had appeared somewhere in the middle of their years together and had never been named or discussed, just become his. "Come inside," he said. "It is getting cold." She let him pull her up from the chair and they went inside to where their children were, and the lamp was burning and the stove was warm, and Marcus put another piece of wood in the stove and Clara looked up from her horses and said, "Papa, does Colt the Second like Governor the Second?" "He tolerates him," Marcus said. "That is not the same as liking," Clara said. "No," Marcus agreed seriously, "but sometimes it is where things start." Clara considered this with the same quality of focused attention she brought to her drawing and then said, "Like you and Mama." Marcus looked at Nora and Nora looked at Marcus. "What do you mean?" Nora asked. "You were strangers," Clara said, returning to her drawing with the authority of someone who had completed a satisfying observation, "and now you like each other very much." James looked up from his book with a 12-year-old's weary patience. "They are married, Clara. It is more than liking." "I know that," Clara said, "but it started somewhere." Marcus put his arm around Nora's shoulders and she leaned against him, and they both looked at their daughter drawing horses by lamplight. And the ranch was quiet and warm around them, and outside the New Mexico night was wide and cold and full of stars. It had started with the wrong name on a letter. It had started with a man who had opened an envelope that was not quite addressed to him and had thought, "Close enough, come west," and had meant it, and a woman who had come west and found that the wrong name had led her to exactly the right man and exactly the right life. That was how it had started. And this, the lamp and the children and the warm house and the strong arm around her shoulders and the land spreading out in all directions under the stars, this was where it had arrived. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of what she had ever wanted when she had sat at that pine table in Ohio and put quill to paper with shaking hands, not knowing she was writing toward this. She pressed closer to Marcus's side and felt him hold her tighter, and they stood there in their kitchen in the territory with their children. And the story of the wrong name and the right answer was not the story that needed telling anymore. This was the story. This warmth. This home. This life they had built out of a letter with a wrong name and a man who had said "come west" and meant every word. Nora Hale Winslow closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her daughter drawing and her son turning pages and her husband breathing beside her, and she thought that she would not change a single letter. Not even the wrong one. Especially not the wrong one.